April 5, 2011. The House of Commons, London. Lord Howell, Foreign Office Minister, rose to make an extraordinary admission that would shake the foundations of how Britain understood its imperial past. The British government revealed that it held an irregular archive of thousands of files from 37 former colonies. British authorities had covertly removed these documents around the time of transfers of power from the later 1940s to the 1980s. For decades, the British government had denied holding any documents about torture, abuse, and systematic violations of human rights in its colonies. When elderly Kenyans sued for compensation, claiming they'd been tortured in British detention camps during the 1950s, officials swore no records existed. The files had been lost, they said, destroyed, gone forever. They were lying. At a secretive government facility in Hanslope Park, Buckinghamshire, lawyers uncovered a cache of approximately 8,800 colonial files that had been deliberately concealed for decades. These weren't ordinary administrative records. These were documents marked Watch, files considered so damaging, so incriminating, that they had to be hidden from the world forever. Files detailing torture methods, sexual abuse, systematic murder. Files that proved British officials at the highest levels knew exactly what was happening in colonial detention camps and ordered it covered up. But the 8,800 files at Hanslope Park were just survivors. Precise instructions were given for methods to be used for destruction, including burning and dumping at sea. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of documents had been systematically destroyed in a program codenamed Operation Legacy. British colonial administrators had spent years burning files, shredding evidence, and dumping weighted crates of documents into the ocean to hide the truth about what Britain had done in its dying empire. This is the story Britain tried to hide from the world. The story of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, a brutal 8-year conflict where it is estimated that over 90,000 Kenyans were executed, tortured, or maimed, and about 160,000 were detained in appalling conditions. This is the story of concentration camps where children died of starvation, of systematic torture including castration and sexual assault, of bombing campaigns against civilian populations, of a counterinsurgency so brutal it shocked even hardened British officers. And this is the story how Britain tried to erase it all, and how 60 years later the truth finally emerged.
The theft of a nation. To understand the Mau Mau uprising, you must first understand what Britain did to Kenya. When Britain declared Kenya a protectorate in 1895, the territory was home to dozens of African communities, each with their own lands, traditions, and governance systems. The largest group were the Kikuyu, living in the fertile highlands of central Kenya, some of the most productive agricultural land in Africa. The British saw that land and decided they wanted it. The settlers, who never numbered more than 1% of the population, occupied much of the best land of the country, the so-called White Highlands, beginning in the early 20th century. Imagine waking up one day to find that your farm, land your family had worked for generations, now belonged to a white settler from Britain. You were squatters on your own land. You could stay, but only if you worked for the new owner. If you refused, armed colonial police would evict you. This happened to hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu families. By 1952, at least 95,000 Africans had moved into Nairobi, where they crowded into urban locations. Displaced from their lands, they flooded into cities looking for work. They found poverty, discrimination, and rage. A system of control. Although the British government had declared in 1923 that Kenya is an African territory and the interests of the African native must be paramount, Africans were in fact treated as second-class citizens and possessed few of the civil or political rights enjoyed by whites. Kenyans couldn't vote, couldn't travel freely within their own country, couldn't live in certain areas. White settlers controlled the government, the courts, the economy, everything. Every African man was required to carry a kipande, an identification pass showing where they were allowed to be and who they worked for. Forget your kipande, you could be arrested, beaten, imprisoned. The system was designed to humiliate, to remind Africans daily that they were subjects, not citizens, that this was Britain's Kenya, not theirs. By the end of World War II, frustration boiled over. In 1944, the Kenya African Union, KAU, was founded, representing a cross-section of Kenya's ethnic groups, overlapping to a large extent the previous Kikuyu Central Association, banned since 1940 but still active. The KAU, led by Jomo Kenyatta, demanded political reforms, land rights, an end to discrimination. They used peaceful protest, petitions, political organizing. The colonial government ignored them. So a more radical group emerged. They met in secret. They administered oaths binding members to fight for independence. By 1952, they had oathed upwards of 90% of the Gikuyu, Embu, and Meru. This group had no unified name at first, but over time they became known as Mau Mau. The violence began. The Mau Mau targeted those they saw as traitors, Kikuyu who collaborated with the colonial government, chiefs appointed by the British, African police, Christian converts who had abandoned traditional ways. Tom Botella, vice president of the KAU and opponent of Mau Mau, was assassinated in 1952. Then came attacks on white settlers. Isolated farms were raided, livestock killed, and in October 1952, Senior Chief Waruhi, a loyal British ally, was assassinated in broad daylight. A state of emergency was declared in October 1952 after the Mau Mau murdered a loyal Kikuyu chief. The colonial governor, Evelyn Baring, ordered mass arrests. Jomo Kenyatta and other KAU leaders were detained, even though Kenyatta publicly condemned Mau Mau violence. In August 1952, Kenyatta told a Kikuyu audience, "Mau Mau has spoiled the country. Let Mau Mau perish forever." It didn't matter. Britain needed scapegoats, and Kenyatta was convicted in a show trial and imprisoned. Leading members of the Mau Mau organization, as well as KAU leaders like Jomo Kenyatta, were detained by the authorities. The state of emergency gave British authorities unlimited powers, powers they would use with devastating brutality. The war had begun, and Britain was determined to crush the Mau Mau by any means necessary.
The military response. Mau Mau guerrillas may have totaled 25,000, but they had few modern weapons. Some were armed with homemade guns, swords, spears, and bows and arrows. Against this ragtag force, Britain deployed overwhelming firepower. The Rising had been defeated, but it had taken 10,000 British and African soldiers, 20,000 police, and 25,000 Kikuyu Home Guard to do it. Tens of thousands of soldiers, supported by artillery, armored vehicles, and the Royal Air Force. This wasn't a police action, it was total war. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force carried out a bombing campaign on the forests where the Mau Mau were based. By mid-1954, the air attacks had killed some 900 rebels and shattered morale. British bombers struck suspected Mau Mau camps in the forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdares. They dropped bombs and napalm on the dense jungle, often with little intelligence about who was actually there. Mau Mau fighters, civilian supporters, innocent families hiding from the violence. The bombs didn't distinguish. But the forest campaign was just one part of Britain's strategy. The real horror was happening in the villages and detention camps. Over 100,000 Boer civilians were forcibly relocated into concentration camps. Wait, wrong war. Let me correct that. Harvard historian Carolyn Elkins estimates that between 160,000 and 320,000 Kenyans were taken to detention camps. In total, she says, up to 1.5 million, including almost the entire Kikuyu population, were forcibly kept either in the camps or the protected villages. 1.5 million people, almost the entire Kikuyu population, rounded up and imprisoned. The protected villages, what an Orwellian term, were concentration camps in all but name. The British implemented a policy of villagization, where they forcibly relocated Kikuyu people into concentration camps. Families were forced from their homes at gunpoint. Their traditional villages were destroyed. They were herded into new settlements surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, where every movement was monitored and controlled. The official justification was protection, protecting civilians from Mau Mau violence. The reality was population control. Separate the guerrillas from their support base, cut off supplies, make resistance impossible. The screening process. For the next few years, these men and women were passed around a network of dozens of detention camps in which torture, forced labor, and isolation were regular occurrences. Screening was the euphemism British authorities used for interrogation. Suspects were brought to camps and screened to determine their level of involvement with Mau Mau. The screening process was torture. Detainees were subjected to arbitrary killings, severe physical assaults, and extreme acts of inhuman and degrading treatment. Beatings with clubs and rifle butts, electric shocks, burning with cigarettes, waterboarding, sexual assault, and worse. Listen to one survivor's testimony. I felt completely and utterly violated by this sexual torture, but I continued to insist that I had not taken an oath. This lasted for about 30 minutes and was very painful. When I was in the tent, I saw this being done to the other 3 women. I had never seen anything so brutal and terrifying in all my life. Another survivor, Kimweli Mbithka Kilacha, described his ordeal. I was forced to lie on my back and my groins were taken. They used pliers and I had a very painful yank of my testicles. Castration, sexual mutilation. These weren't isolated incidents by rogue soldiers. Detainees were subjected to severe beatings and other forms of torture by the colonial administration, including castrations and severe sexual assaults, which in many cases left these men and women with lifelong physical and mental scars. This was policy. The pipeline. The British created what they called the pipeline, a system of camps categorized by the prisoner's supposed level of compliance. White camps held those who renounced Mau Mau. Gray camps held those who might be persuaded. Black camps, the hardcore camps like Manyani and Hola, held the irreconcilables. Those deemed irreconcilable were exiled to far-flung corners of the colony, for example at Hola. At Hola Camp, the British conducted an experiment in breaking the will of hardcore detainees. In March 1959, guards forced 11 prisoners to dig trenches in the scorching heat. When they refused, guards beat them. There, 11 detainees were beaten to death in March 1959, a scandal that played a key role in ending the emergency and pushing Kenya towards eventual independence. 11 men beaten to death. The medical examiner ruled the deaths resulted from shock and hemorrhage due to multiple bruising caused by violence. In other words, they were beaten so severely they died. Conditions there were poor, disease was rife, and food in short supply. Maltreatment also included torture and summary executions, the most notorious incident occurring at the Hola camp, where 11 detainees were killed by their African prison wardens. The Hola massacre sparked outrage in Britain. Members of Parliament demanded answers. How could British forces be running camps where prisoners were beaten to death? The government promised reforms, investigations, accountability. But behind the scenes, they were planning something entirely else, making sure the evidence disappeared.
The order to destroy. As Kenyan independence approached, British colonial administrators faced a problem. The filing cabinets and government archives were full of documents that, if inherited by the incoming Kenyan government, would be devastating. Documents detailing torture methods, reports of massacres, correspondence about concentration camps, instructions to use excessive force, files proving British officials in London knew exactly what was happening and approved it. These documents couldn't be allowed to survive. The colonial secretary ordered that the independent Kenyan government should not inherit papers that might embarrass Her Majesty's government or other governments, might embarrass members of the police, military forces, public servants, or others, such as police agents or informers. On February 28, 1961, W.J. Marquand authored a memo titled Operation Legacy, the program to systematically destroy or hide incriminating documents across the dying British Empire. The permanent secretary at the Ministry of Defense in Nairobi then sent out a memo titled the designation Watch, in which he ordered the division of government records into watch files, the sensitive ones, could only be seen by authorized officers. And those authorized officers had to be a British subject of European descent. Even in the final days of empire, racial hierarchy determined who could be trusted with the truth. How to destroy an empire's crimes. The instructions were meticulous. Further orders detailed methods of destroying classified documents, describing how each department should have set policies on routine destruction and emergency destruction, including burning documents. And if burning wasn't possible, the colonial secretary even went to the lengths of suggesting other creative ways of destroying these documents, noting that it is permissible, as an alternative to destruction by fire, for documents to be packed in weighted crates and dumped in very deep and current-free water at maximum practicable distance from the coast. Burn them, shred them, drown them in the ocean, whatever it took to hide the truth. Under Operation Legacy, colonial administrators burnt, shredded, or sunk thousands of records at the end of empire to prevent incriminating paperwork falling into the hands of post-independence rulers. Across Kenya, British officials worked frantically. "What's burnt won't be missed," exclaimed a British officer. He was frantically going through piles of papers. He had already sent 423 files to the incinerator, and there were many more to go. It was sad and sometimes heavy work. But Operation Legacy wasn't limited to Kenya. This article aims to illustrate what they were doing not just in Borneo, but all over the world, implementing one of the most spectacular destructions of historical records known in our time. From Malta to Malaysia, from Aden to the Bahamas, British colonial administrators destroyed evidence. Over 8,800 colonial-era documents have been eliminated by UK authorities in former colonies. The program was most powerful in the 50s and 60s, all across the 23 British-occupied countries and territories that eventually became independent after the Second World War. In British Guiana, modern-day Guyana, historian Richard Drayton was the first to point out there were no documents for British Guyana. In other words, unlike in Kenya, where some documents were hidden, in British Guyana, they were all destroyed. Every single document, a complete erasure of the historical record.
In 1957, 5 lorries full of documents arrived at the Royal Navy base in Singapore from Kuala Lumpur. The files contained information on a case of murder that happened in 1948 in Batang Kali in the British-ruled Malaya, where British soldiers were responsible for the massacre of 24 rubber plantation workers. Convenient that those files needed to be destroyed at a special naval facility, isn't it? Kenya fights for truth. Since the 1960s, the government of Kenya has made numerous attempts to request for the return of these documents, first through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then through the Kenyan National Archives. The British response was consistent: deny, delay, deflect. A 1983 policy document laid out the strategy. Policy line in Kenya was therefore to admit that the records were migrated or destroyed prior to independence, that the records migrated or destroyed concerned the development of UK policy, or that they related to a third country, made it necessary to withhold them, that the removal of these documents was in relation with the usual policy by which the secret documents of one government were not left to its successors, and, frankly, HMG is unable to return these documents and cannot negotiate on this. We took them, we destroyed them, we won't give them back, and we won't discuss it. For 50 years, this was Britain's position. The files were gone, the truth was buried. The empire's crimes would remain hidden forever. But survivors remembered, and some were determined to fight for justice.
5 elderly Kenyans versus the British government. June 23, 2009, a law firm called Lee Day filed the lawsuit that would crack open Britain's carefully constructed wall of silence. On June 23, 2009, the Mau Mau, with the assistance of the Kenya Human Rights Commission, KHRC, and Lee Day Law Firm, issued a claim for compensation for alleged torture against the British government on behalf of 5 elderly Kenyans who had been detained and tortured by the British colonial administration. 5 survivors: Ndiku Mutua, Paulo Nzili, Wambugu Wanyingi, Jane Mutoni Mara, Susan Ngondi. They were old now, in their 70s and 80s, but they carried scars, physical and psychological, from what Britain had done to them half a century earlier. Paulo Nzili had been castrated. Jane Mutoni Mara had been sexually tortured. Wambugu Wanyingi had been beaten unconscious multiple times. Wambugu was born in 1928 in Nyeri District, Central Province. Prior to his arrest, he worked as a tractor driver and was a member of the Kenya African Union, KAU. At no point did he take the Mau Mau oath. On 24 December 1952, Wambugu was arrested at his home by a group of 7 white officers from the Kenya Regiment at about 1 a.m. He hadn't taken any oath, hadn't fought with Mau Mau. He was a member of a political party. That was his crime. The government denies everything. The British government challenged the case on 2 grounds: state succession and limitation. The legal arguments were technical, but the message was clear: we're not responsible. Even if these things happened, which we deny, it was the colonial government's doing. That liability transferred to independent Kenya. And besides, it happened too long ago. The claims are time-barred. Most importantly, the government insisted, we have no documents. The files were destroyed or lost during the transition to independence. There's no evidence to support these wild allegations. The lawyers didn't believe them. The hidden vault. Researchers and lawyers dug deeper. They found references in public documents to files that supposedly didn't exist, cross-references to watch files in Kenyan archives that led nowhere. Then came the breakthrough.
At a secretive government facility in Hounslow Park, Buckinghamshire, they uncovered a cache of approximately 8,800 colonial files that had been deliberately concealed for decades. Hounslow Park, a secure facility in the English countryside where Britain stored its deepest secrets. Files from the Colonial Office, marked classified, that had been hidden from public view for half a century. The FCO was forced to reveal the existence of some 1,500 government files secretly removed from Kenya on the eve of independence, a process known as Operation Legacy. They provided many unseen documents which described in detail the systemic torture of detainees during the emergency between 1952 and 1960. The documents were devastating. Detailed reports of torture methods, correspondence between colonial officials discussing how to maintain plausible deniability about abuse, instructions from London approving harsh interrogation techniques, files proving senior British officials knew exactly what was happening in the camps and did nothing to stop it. The Kenyan documents proved among the most damaging discoveries, revealing systematic torture, sexual abuse, and murder in detention camps during the Mau Mau emergency between 1952 and 1960. These documents are now stored under a file known as FCO 141 at the National Archives in London. 20,000 files from 37 countries, all hidden away at Hounslow Park. And these were just the survivors. A large number of papers are believed to have been totally destroyed, either burnt or dumped in the ocean. Hence, what we can see now is only a tiny family of survivors from an entire group that faced extermination. For every file at Hounslow Park, how many had been burnt, dumped in the ocean, lost forever? The British government's defense collapsed. On April 5, 2011, Lord Howell stood in Parliament and admitted the truth. The British government revealed that it held an irregular archive of thousands of files from 37 former colonies. The British administration in Kenya took steps before December 1963 to remove the UK records relating to the administration of the Mau Mau emergency, so that these would not be among the records handed over to the incoming independent Kenyan government. Britain had lied for 50 years, and now, finally, the proof was undeniable. Justice, finally. The lawsuit continued. KHRC and Lee Day continued their investigations and identified over 5,000 further victims of colonial-era torture in Kenya, who subsequently became their clients. The case expanded from 5 claimants to over 5,000. Facing overwhelming evidence and a public relations disaster, the British government capitulated. The negotiations yielded a settlement on June 6, 2013, in which the British government abandoned their pending appeal and further agreed to issue a statement of apology that was delivered in the British Parliament, acknowledging that Kenyans had been subjected to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of colonial authorities, and the British government expressed a sincere regret for the same. Foreign Secretary William Hague stood in the House of Commons on June 6, 2013, and read the apology. Britain acknowledged what it had done, expressed sincere regret. The out-of-court settlement also included the British government paying out a compensation package of £2,600 to each claimant for 5,228 victims identified by KHRC and Lee Day, financing the construction of a memorial in Kenya in remembrance of the victims of torture during the colonial era, and paying all the legal costs of the case. Nearly £20 million in compensation, a memorial to the victims, and most importantly, acknowledgement of the truth. On September 12, 2015, thousands of Mau Mau veterans traveled to Nairobi to witness the unveiling of the memorial. Many were elderly, in wheelchairs, using canes, but they came to see justice finally recognized. After 60 years, Britain had finally admitted what it had done.
The true cost. It is estimated that over 90,000 Kenyans were executed, tortured, or maimed, and about 160,000 were detained in appalling conditions. 90,000 executed, tortured, or maimed, 160,000 detained, 1.5 million forcibly relocated. Although the Mau Mau murdered a number of white settlers, the vast majority of their victims were fellow Africans. By the end of the emergency, 32 European civilians had died at the hands of the Mau Mau, but so had over 1,800 Africans. This wasn't a war between Britain and Mau Mau. It was a civil war within Kenyan society, with Britain backing one side with overwhelming force. Kikuyu killed Kikuyu. Families were torn apart, communities destroyed. And Britain's counterinsurgency tactics, concentration camps, torture, collective punishment, became a model that would be repeated across the dying empire and beyond. The cover-up continues. The 2013 settlement resolved the Kenyan case, but Operation Legacy's effects continue. The deliberate loss of more recent records from Kenya suggests Whitehall failed to reform and has continued to destroy files on controversial military activity in East Africa. In 2021, the Ministry of Defense admitted it had destroyed the majority of physical files from its Kenya headquarters before 2015, files that might have provided evidence in ongoing cases about British military abuses. Human Rights Watch says it appears to be a deliberate and shocking attempt to obstruct justice for Kenyan victims of UK military abuses. The pattern continues. Destroy the evidence, deny responsibility, wait until the victims are dead. What we still don't know. Some 8,800 files were consequently stored in Britain. Only 8,800 survivors from an empire that spanned the globe for centuries. How many files were destroyed? We'll never know. How many crimes were committed that left no documentary trace? How many victims suffered and died without ever receiving justice or even acknowledgement? Professor Elkins states there is no record of how many people died as a result of torture, hard labor, sexual abuse, malnutrition, and starvation. The British government made sure of that. The records were burned, dumped in the ocean, hidden away in secret vaults. Lessons unlearned. The Mau Mau case opened a window into Britain's imperial past that many would prefer remain shut. It revealed not just the brutality of colonial rule, but the systematic effort to hide that brutality from history. It proved that when historians wrote about the empire relying on official documents, they were working with a deliberately falsified record. The documents that would have shown the truth had been destroyed precisely to create a false historical narrative. Some might argue historians should be forgiven as there were no official colonial documents that revealed a British policy of human rights violations in Kenya. But what happens when the absence of proof is really due to the deliberate removal of evidence? The implications go far beyond Kenya. If Britain systematically destroyed evidence in 37 territories, what other crimes were hidden? What other victims have been denied justice because the evidence no longer exists? Professor Elkins states there is no record of how many people died as a result of torture, hard labor, sexual abuse, malnutrition, and starvation. The British government made sure of that. The records were burned, dumped in the ocean, hidden away in secret vaults. The incomplete victory.
Despite this historic victory, this out-of-court settlement did not comprehensively address numerous underlying issues of colonial repression. 5,000 Kenyans received compensation, but tens of thousands more suffered and received nothing. Many died before justice arrived. The £2,600 payment, less than £50 for each year of waiting, was a pittance compared to the suffering endured. And Britain's apology was carefully worded, sincere regret, not an admission of systematic state-sponsored torture, an acknowledgement of suffering, not an acceptance of criminal responsibility. The memorial in Nairobi stands as a testament to the victims, but it also stands as a reminder that Britain tried to erase this history entirely and almost succeeded. Final thoughts. The Mau Mau uprising was one chapter in a much larger story, the story of how Britain's empire ended and how Britain tried to control the narrative of that ending by destroying the evidence. Operation Legacy wasn't an aberration, it was policy, deliberate, systematic, approved at the highest levels. Britain decided that preserving its reputation mattered more than historical truth, that protecting officials from accountability mattered more than justice for victims. For 50 years it worked. The files were hidden, the truth was buried, survivors were dismissed as exaggerating or lying. The official history, written from sanitized documents, painted empire in softer colors. But truth has a way of surviving. Documents that were supposed to disappear were found. Survivors who were supposed to be forgotten fought back. Lawyers and historians who were told nothing existed kept digging. And in 2011, the wall of silence finally cracked. The war Britain tried to hide from the world can no longer be hidden. The files at Hanslope Park, those that survived the bonfires and the ocean depths, tell a story Britain never wanted told. A story of systematic torture, of concentration camps, of a counterinsurgency campaign so brutal it shocked even those who implemented it. And most damningly, a story of how Britain, when its empire's crimes threatened to be exposed, chose to burn the evidence rather than face the truth. The files may have burned, but the scars remain. And now, finally, the world knows.